Hello, my name is Edicson Gonzales. I'm a bookseller here at the Book Loft in German Village. The Book Loft today is hosting Dan Alexander. He is a senior editor at Forbes magazine, and he's a native of the Columbus area. Dan is here to talk about his new book, White House Inc., How Donald Trump Turned the Presidency into a Business. How's it going, Dan?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I would rather be there in person, but phoning in from here is the second best thing, I suppose.
Right. It's social distancing is very important these days, but maybe someday, we'll have you host you here at the Book Loft.
It will not be my first time there. I can promise you that.
So Dan, getting into the book, I thought was really kind of interesting, kind of to start off the book in this really kind of subtle way. You open the book before even the first page. You kind of have like these couple of these attention getters that kind of like get you like, oh, okay. The first being that you put in a net worth for the president, someone who is very guarded and secretive with his financial records and that sort of nature. And then when you put out the portfolio, you have like a list of like his most valuable properties. And I think that is something that when readers get a look at seeing that, it's going to take them for like a loop, because what they probably assume in their head is the most valuable property really isn't that. And so can you describe the process of, finding out that kind of information and then talking about, what is the most valuable property for Donald Trump?
Yeah, sure thing. So, twice a year for Forbes, I put together our estimate of Trump's net worth. And of course, this is something that Donald Trump cares deeply about. He really, really wants to be higher on the Forbes list every single time. And it's a difficult process, as you mentioned, because we don't have full access to his financials. But what we do have are a surprising amount of documentation that is listed in SEC filings that come out through his lenders, also that come out through his business partners. And we can put that information together to figure out what the operating income is of his businesses. And then we call up experts in every industry in which Trump plays. So, I'll call up more than 75 experts every 6 months and ask them, what are the valuations of these sorts of buildings? What are they trading at? What are the multiples? If you have a building, let's say it's Trump Tower, so Trump Tower throws off about $13 million a year in net operating income. If you have a building like Trump Tower that's throwing off $13 million of net operating income, what's the multiple that you would apply to that to then figure out the value of the building? And then once you have all of the valuations, then you subtract the debt. And so, the numbers move, all the time with the markets and, with how Trump's own properties are performing. And as we're constantly getting in more data, we'll incorporate that. So when I close the book, the numbers in the book are as of March, and then we just updated them as of September recently. And so the latest numbers are that Trump's assets total are worth $3.66 billion, and his debt is $1.1 billion. So his net worth works out to $2.5 billion. In terms of which properties are his most valuable, it is sort of surprising. So the two most valuable properties in the portfolio are 555 California Street, in which Trump owns a 30% interest. This is just a large anonymous skyscraper out in San Francisco. And the second one is 1290 Avenue of the Americas in New York. Again, he owns a 30% interest there. Those 30% interests are worth more than any of the 100% interests that Trump holds in more famous properties that have his name on it. So, Trump Tower or the Trump Hotel in DC or Trump National Doral in Miami. None of those things are worth nearly as much money as his interest in 555 California and 1290 Avenue of the Americas, which are not managed by Trump and therefore are managed very, very professionally and have been extremely successful in getting their rents up and getting their profits up, which in turn makes them much more valuable.
Right. So let's talk about 555 California Street. And so what is it about the property itself that makes it very lucrative and important to the Trump portfolio and to his net worth?
So it's just a tremendous amount of rent flowing in. So, the tenants in that building are sort of a who's who of corporate America. You have, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Microsoft, KKR, the private equity firm, and then you've got, Starbucks is in the bottom. You've got a video game developer paying huge rents up top. You have the consulting firm McKinsey. So it's like any real estate mogul's dream list of tenants, and they pay a tremendous amount of money. If you add up the rents in that building and 1290 Avenue of the Americas, and even if you only count 30% of them attributable for Trump's 30% stake, that adds up to about $100 million in rent per year flowing through those two buildings. And that's about half of all of the rent coming into Trump's portfolio, just in those two buildings that, frankly, nobody's really paying much of attention to. But if you start to look through those rosters of tenants, then you'll see that there are basically infinite potential conflicts of interest buried in there. And because prior to the book, there wasn't much reporting about who these tenants were or how much they were paying, that was a big mystery that we've uncovered in the book, and you can see all of the different potential issues that flow from there, and we can get into that a little bit if you want to.
Absolutely, because in the roster of potential conflicts of interest, there was one that really, caught my attention that even I didn't even know about. Can you explain why the Qatari investment fund is a tenant in the building, and what kind of conflicts of interest does that open the president up to in regards to kind of situations that were happening with the country in the first couple of years of his administration?
Yeah, so while I was researching the book, I came across a document that was kind of like the holy grail document that I had been looking for, that laid out the tenants in those two buildings, 555 California and 1290 Avenue of the Americas. And one of the tenants that I found on this list was on the 43rd floor. It listed Qatar Investment Authority. This is a sovereign wealth fund out of Qatar that basically acts as an arm of the Qatari government. And, my eyes about popped out of my head when I saw it, because I had not heard of this deal. And when I searched for it, there was no trace of it. There was nothing online that said that the Qatar Investment Authority had an office in that building. There had been, no reporting about it. And so it was just this one document that I had stumbled upon, and that was it. And I didn't know whether it was real. So I booked a flight out to California, and there's some security down at the bottom of the building. So in order to get past them, fortunately, there's a co-working space that was on the 49th floor. And so I reserved a desk at the co-working space, and then that allowed me to get past the guards at the bottom, get into the elevator banks, and then I went up to the 49th floor, dropped my bags, went down to the 43rd floor, and got off the elevator. And when I got off, I took a left, and there it was. It was, just sort of a beautiful, gleaming office space, with really nice furniture. They had done this really intricate white lattice work in the entryway, nice, white counters at the reception desk. And behind it was a big sign that said Qatar Investment Authority. And so this was, the document coming to life. And there's this moment, where you're sitting there and you're looking at it and you're connecting the dots, So this is a foreign government paying to rent space in the president's most valuable building. No one knows about it. And then the most shocking thing is, as I looked around the office, no one was there. It looked like it just wasn't being used at all. There was no one at the reception desk. When I looked through, and by the way, this is pre-COVID. This is December of 2019. So, I could see interior glass walls in the conference rooms and stuff, but nobody was in those rooms. And so you sort of start scratching your head and say, why could this be happening? And is this a regular business transaction? It doesn't necessarily look like it. I came back the next day, knocked on the door again, nobody answered. Ended up speaking to somebody who worked in the building, who said that the only time that they ever saw anyone in or out of that space was during construction. And after that, they had never seen anyone go in. And so you've got the Qataris paying to rent this space, no clear business purpose behind it. And then you start looking at, all right, well, what's going on with U.S. policy toward Qatar? And that's when, things get really interesting. When Trump first comes in, the first overseas trip that he takes is to Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis and the Qataris are both U.S. allies, but they're fighting between each other. And the Saudis are accusing the Qataris of funding terrorists. And the Qataris, of course, deny this. And Trump goes over and the Saudi leaders explain this to him, and he basically, buys what they're saying. And he comes back and he accuses the Qataris of funding terrorists. And everyone's kind of like, wait a second, this is a U.S. ally that you're saying is funding terrorists. This isn't a light charge for the president to make. And Trump sort of explains it as, well, I'm the guy they, elected to come shake things up. And, I'm going to tell it like it is. And, if I think that they're funding terrorists, then I'm going to say that they're funding terrorists. So Qatar then, sometime after February of 2018, moves into this office space. And later that year, the president invites the Emir of Qatar to Washington and hosts him in the Oval Office. And at this meeting, he says the exact opposite thing of what he'd been saying at first. In fact, he thanks the Emir of Qatar for helping fight against funding terrorists. And the Emir of Qatar is sitting next to him, and he's like, I just want to make one thing clear, Mr. President, like, we never funded terrorists. And Trump sort of nods along. And then, about a year after that, Trump brings him back to the US, and this time also invites several of the leaders of the Qatari Investment Authority, as well as other, leadership in Qatar. And they have this huge dinner in, of all places, something called the cash room of the Treasury Department. So this is a room where the United States used to store its gold and its silver and its paper currency. And the Secretary of the Treasury stands up to give a sort of a welcome. And he says, this room is a fitting tribute to the security and economic partnerships between our two countries, basically saying, it's money that binds us together. And then Trump stands up and gives his own remarks and is addressing the Qataris. And he says, I just want you to know that your investments in the United States are very much appreciated. And so you've got all of this stuff going on, this secret deal, doesn't seem to be a clear business purpose, a 180 in U.S. foreign policy in, one of the most important regions in the world. And it leaves you wondering whether this, Trump's business arrangement and the fact that he, held on to it and therefore allowed people to pay him while he was in office, is the reason for the change in U.S. policy. And it's very difficult to get inside somebody's head, so we don't know that for sure. But there's been no previous president where we've had to wonder whether that was the case.
Right. And so this is really kind of like the crux of the book, and the constant conflict of interest and the appearances of conflict of interest that really kind of overshadow the presidency and the administration of Donald Trump. And so I know that there's a passage in the book where you're talking about in chapter 7, All the President's Tenants, where you're talking about how at the 20th floor of Trump Tower, the Commercial Bank of China, which is owned at 70% by the Chinese government, is renting out a space somewhere between, originally it starts at 20,000 square feet and then gets renegotiated into 15,000 square feet. But they're paying about $1.9 million to rent out this space. So how is it that, how is it that the president is able to kind of get away from these kind of appearances of conflict of interest, and how is it not necessarily a violation of the annulments clause within the Constitution?
So just because he's doing it doesn't mean that it's not a violation. There ongoing lawsuits right now accusing the president of violating the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. And, you might remember that when Trump first took office, one of his promises to separate his business from his presidency was that he was going to donate all foreign government profits back to the US Treasury. And if you just look at that one lease, and you just look at how much the Chinese bank paid in 2017 and 2018, Trump's first 2 years in office, that adds up to $3.8 million. And then if you look at the amount of money that that building generates in profit, it's about a 40 to 42% profit margin in Trump Tower. So if you take 40 to 42% on $3.8 million, you're somewhere in the neighborhood of about $2 million. And if you look at what Trump actually donated to the US Treasury in those 2 years, it's less than 1/3 of that amount. So it's very clear just from looking at this one deal that Trump is not living up to his promise to donate all foreign government profits to the US Treasury. And that's before we get to Qatar. It's before we get to the Bank of India, which is also state-owned and had space in 555 California Street. It's before we get to the Abu Dhabi Tourism and Culture Authority, which also had space in Trump Tower. It's before we get to any of the foreign leaders or foreign governments staying or eating dinner or racking up a bar tab at the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. And it's before we get to any of his other properties around the world where foreign governments have also stayed. So that's one of the fundamental promises that Trump made right at the start. And we can tell just by looking at the math that he's broken it.
So, in regards to, you just mentioned the Trump International Hotel, I wanted to say that one of my favorite chapters in the book is chapter 4, Presidential Palace. I think it really highlights your skills as a journalist and kind of painting this like vivid picture of like all these kind of different power players and just kind of like the hotel scenarios and like the way that it's kind of like how it's in and out, kind of like all these different kind of characters. Can you speak to how you were able to conduct your research for that chapter, and what were kind of some of the things that you were able to witness on any given night as you were kind of like studying the ins and outs of the hotel?
Yeah, for sure. So it's not hard to get inside these properties, and I didn't even have to book a hotel room. I was staying in a different hotel down the street because its rates were cheaper. And, so I just got in a cab, went down to the Trump International Hotel and just walked into the lobby, and I just sat down for a dinner. And, in DC, you're allowed to record it's a one-party consent state. So you don't have to ask every person that you're recording if they want to be on a recorder. So that gives somebody in my position the chance to basically soak in the scene better. And so you can just sit down and just turn on a recorder. And therefore, anything that happens while you're there, you have documentation of it and you can remember it and you can paint the scene, for your readers. So what the whole book is, the challenge of it is that it's a business book and there's a lot of numbers in it. But the fun of it is to make those numbers come to life and, to take you inside the hotel, to show you, who all is walking around. The night that I was there was a night that Bill Barr, the Attorney General, had booked space inside the presidential ballroom. And that bill was going to run at least at about $30,000 for the night. And so I posted up expecting to see Bill Barr come parading through and perhaps the president and, all these cabinet officials. And what ended up happening was despite, a lot of hype, and even like the guy who was serving me at my table was like, oh, you're going to see somebody tonight. It's a big night at the hotel. Despite all that, I'm looking around and I don't see these people. And so the only person that I saw was there's a guy named Jonathan O'Connell, who's a reporter at the Washington Post, who is on the same beat, who also covers Trump's business. And he was walking around looking for the same thing. And so he walks over and I say hi to him, and we're both just sort of trying to figure out what the heck's going on. Like, where's the party? And so finally, I talked to a bunch of the security people. I talked to waiters walking by. I'm talking to everyone who I possibly can to figure out, is there something going on in the presidential ballroom? The ballroom itself, the entryway to the ballroom is blocked off, so I can't go into the ballroom. So finally, at about the time that I figured that the party would be ending, and this is right around Christmas time of last year. So, it's a big season for fancy hotels. They get a lot of Christmas parties and that sort of thing. So right as I expect the party to be ending, I decided to post up right outside of the doors and just wait to see, who walks out. Again, expecting, a parade of tuxedos of, people who I recognize, and but it never comes. And so I walk around to the back of the building. There's a back entrance. I'm posted up there. I talked to a couple of guys who work in the hotel who were like out on their cigarette break, and they're like, "Yeah, man, we don't think that there's a party tonight. We're not really sure," which contradicted what the waiter had said inside. So finally, I go up to a different entrance to the presidential ballroom, and that one's not blocked off, and so I can walk in. And it's probably, at this point, it's like 10 o'clock at night or something like that, and the hotel's starting to thin out. And I walk back straight to the presidential ballroom, and I sort of press my ear up against the door. There's no noise inside. This is supposed to be like a big Irish party with like a lot of Irish music, and you're picturing like, and so I open up the door and I look inside, and there's not a soul there. There's stacks of chairs. The place looks perfectly clean, and what ended up happening was that Bill Barr, his spokesperson told me the next day, decided that he just wasn't going to have his party that night. And why wasn't he going to have his party that night? Well, because people like me and Jonathan O'Connell were going to be walking around the whole time, looking for people and trying to see what was going on. They had, there were protesters outside that had these signs that said "Disbar Bar," as you're coming into the hotel. It's not exactly the most welcoming scene for a party to, come into. So he decided to call it off. So the result is that Trump's ballroom, here right in the thick of the Christmas season, is empty on a night when you would have expected it to be bringing in tens of thousands of dollars. And, although it wasn't the story that I expected to find, oftentimes when you're surprised in your reporting, that's better, because it means that you've uncovered something that is new. You're learning, and therefore so will the reader. And as I started to pick apart the financials a little bit more, I realized that this hotel that, everyone assumed was this just hauling in money because, it was getting all this attention as this place for Trump people to hang out and spend big bucks, that its business was really struggling. And that things like, Bill Barr canceling his hotel or his party, were happening over and over. People weren't booking because they were afraid of offending their friends, or, people didn't want to have a business conference there because they, 30% of the people that they were going to invite were going to be liberal and they wouldn't even show up. Or, if you are staying in DC for, for some, business trip, if you're a liberal, you're not going to look at the Trump. Who cares if it's the cheapest one around? First of all, it's not the cheapest one around, but even if it were, you're not going to stay there because you don't want to be putting money in Trump's pocket. And all of that stuff adds up to less revenue, smaller profits, and ultimately this hotel that everyone's assumed is such a cash cow, it turns out is actually hemorrhaging money.
Right, and so you're talking about kind of like the toxicity of like the Trump band as it's going in through its first couple of years in the administration. And I was wondering, in terms of like that kind of toxicity, has it permeated into other aspects of the Trump business? And if so, how has it affected other aspects of the Trump business?
Yeah, I mean, it started right away. On the day that he announced his presidential campaign, and he had the famous line where he said, that Mexicans are rapists, and I assume some of them are good people too. That was offensive enough to corporate America that he immediately lost a lot of his product licensing partners, like within a couple of days. So right there, that's the first effect. Then once he does take office, he says that he's not going to do any new foreign deals. He ends up doing foreign deals anyways, but he limits the amount of sort of high profile foreign deals that he's doing. So that limits his hotel licensing opportunities. Then you look at properties like Trump National Doral, his resort in Miami. In 2015, Trump National Doral brought in $92 million of revenue and turned a profit of about $13 million. The next year, when he won the presidency, that revenue declined to $87 million and the profits dropped to $12 million and change. And in 2017, the first year that he's president, all of those conferences that had booked a bunch of rooms at Doral, many of them left. Trump actually lost 100,000 booked room nights at Doral after the election. And this is only a 643 room resort, which is a large resort, but 100,000 booked room nights, that's like 5 months of fully booked business. It's a huge deal to lose all that business. And so in 2017, the revenues drop even further and the profits fall to only like $4.3 million. It's barely enough money for Trump to pay the interest on the loans that he has at that property. And so if you look across his portfolio, the places that are most closely aligned with Trump and with the Trump brand, whether it's his hotel licensing or his product licensing or the Trump Hotel or Trump National Doral, those businesses are really struggling. The ones that are doing well are the ones that are not as closely connected to his brand. So, people haven't heard of 555 California Street and don't know that Donald Trump owns it. That's a good thing for his business. Same thing with 1290 Avenue of the Americas in New York City. Those two properties are by far the best performers in his portfolio. And part of that is because they're managed by somebody else, but a lot of that is because they're not branded Trump. And so no one knows that he owns them. And so they've been able to withstand sort of the polarization just fine.
And so, as you paint this picture of kind of like these conflicts of interest within the administration, I wonder, has the Trump administration or the Trump organization given you a comment or as in regards to your book?
Yeah. So they.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So they comment. No, it's all good. My connection got a little fuzzy there. So if you weren't done, feel free to finish up.
Oh, no, you're good. I wanted, yeah, you can continue. I'm sorry.
So I'll okay. All right. Sounds good. So they, have commented in the past to me with my work at Forbes about various stories that I've done. I'd say they probably comment on, I don't know, maybe 40% of the stories or something like that. For the book, they have elected to just do a blanket no comment. They, the White House responded and said, these are all questions for the Trump organization. The Trump organization did not respond to multiple requests for comment. I sent them pages and pages of questions months before the book came out. They didn't respond to any of them. And since the book has come out, they haven't responded either. So I think, there's a lot of news going on right now. And they're probably just hoping that his business stays out of it as much as possible. And with the exception of the tax returns that came out, that's mostly worked for them. I mean, different things have sucked up airtime, but obviously, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passing away dominated the headlines for a week. Trump having the coronavirus is dominating the headlines right now. We've got another debate coming up between the vice presidential candidates. That'll suck up at least a day or two of airtime. And then we've got two more presidential debates coming up. And if they're anything like the first one, those things will get plenty of attention as well. So, So I think that their hope is that the business can sort of stay, stay out of focus, and we'll see if they're able to be successful with that strategy going through to the election.
And so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, because you mentioned it just now, the tax return story that was done by the New York Times. In regards to that story, what was it in the story that maybe kind of confirmed some of your research or journalism in regards to the Trump finances? And what were some things that even took you for surprise in regards to the story?
Yeah. So the broad outlines of the story in terms of which properties were doing well, which properties weren't doing well, all matched what my own reporting had been. Doral in trouble, the DC Hotel's in trouble, 1290 Avenue of the Americas, 555 California Street, and the commercial real estate portfolio is doing fine. The licensing businesses are in trouble. The part that they uncovered, which was just fantastic reporting on their part, was figuring out how you get a business that is really valuable. And these are real assets that throw off big money, and that does produce large net operating income. In other words, its business does churn out significant profits. And you make it look to the IRS like that business is bringing in no profit or huge losses. And there are a lot of different mechanisms for that, some of which are standard, just deducting interest or taking depreciation, others of which are very aggressive. So, for example, like paying Ivanka Trump, it looks like she was receiving a consulting fee at the same time that she was an employee of the Trump organization, which would allow then Donald Trump to write off that consulting fee and therefore pay less in taxes. So it was a mix of strategies that they used. And of course, a lot of people use different strategies to limit their tax burden, but to get it all the way down to basically zero is very difficult and requires some very creative accounting. And their reporting was great in pointing out where exactly and how exactly they had gotten those numbers so low.
And so, as an expert in finance, and you're obviously the senior editor at Forbes magazine, reviewing that kind of information, is there something that kind of like pushes to the edge some of these like tax laws, or is there a possibility that there is some sort of illegality regarding the new tax information that we now know?
Well, there's definitely the possibility of illegality. I mean, but these things take investigation and take interviews of the people involved, and that requires subpoenas to get those people to sit. Eric Trump just sat today, in one of the investigations from New York State, which is over basically the allegations are that they were overinflating the value of their assets in certain cases and underinflating the value of their assets in other cases, which is something that I'm very familiar with them doing from my work at Forbes. But of course, when you do it to financial institutions, it's much more serious than when you do it to Forbes magazine. So he's, these are motivated prosecutors who are taking a real look at a lot of, big financial questions. And, it's going to cause him some real headaches. Anyone who tells you for sure right now that he, is convicted and that these are for sure crimes that he committed is getting out ahead of the process. So we'll see how it plays out. But, this is not a good position for him to be in.
And so before we wrap up this interview, I kind of want to end it on like a little bit of a lighthearted kind of note. There is a story you tell in the book involving Spy Magazine. I was hoping you could tell it and kind of like talk about kind of the absurdity of that story for our viewers.
Sure. So, Spy Magazine was this magazine that was around in New York only for like a few years, and then it went defunct. But it got sort of a cult following, and one of the things that they did was they were trying to figure out who was the cheapest rich person in New York. And so in order to do it, they created a fake company. I forget the name of the company, but they just created an LLC. And they wrote a bunch of checks to people. And I forget the exact amounts of the checks, but they were small amounts. Maybe it started at $5 or something like that. And so they sent out a bunch of these checks to, and again, I forget the exact number, but say it's 100 people. You know, baseball players, business people, TV mogul, you know, all these famous wealthy people, to see who would take the time to cash the check. And so they sent out the first round, and, you know, maybe half the people cashed the check. So then they followed up with that half of the people, and they sent them an even smaller check to see if they would cash that check. And so again, let's say that the second check was, I don't know, $1. So then and it's a story that shows you that for as much money as Donald Trump has, he has always cared about small amounts of cash. And that's a particularly threatening thing for the president, because it means that, you know, people like, for example, the Qataris can put small amounts of money into his empire. In their case, you know, their annual rent's only like, if they're paying market rates, it's like $450,000. So his 30% of that would be like 135 grand. So you could put that into the president's empire. That costs nothing. And it could potentially have an impact on the way that he thinks.
Dan Alexander, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. The new book is called White House Inc., How Donald Trump Turned the Presidency into a Business. And we'll have a link here at the bottom of the video where you can get the book at bookloft.com, and you can get the book at bookloft.com or wherever books are sold. Thank you, Dan.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be back in Columbus, even if it's only virtually.
Absolutely. Okay. I want to thank you once again for taking the time to speak to us today. This was
sure thing.
A fun interview. And hopefully when things get back to normal, you'll have another book out and we can have you here in person at the store.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you have a wonderful day. And hopefully things don't get any crazier for you in the next couple of days.
Yeah, we'll see here.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks for your time and thanks for your interest.
Thank you. You have a wonderful day.
All right, great. Thanks. You too.